And without further ado, I want to welcome everybody to Infrastructure Week 2021. My sincere appreciation to all attendees and presenters. This event is part of a nationwide movement led by United for Infrastructure, based out of Washington, D.C., founded in 2013, consisting of over 500 cross-sector affiliates to drive infrastructure investment and highlight opportunities within the built environment. Infrastructure Week serves as a platform for professional stewardship and advocacy, public awareness, and community engagement. It represents a collaborative movement between public, private, and nonprofit organizations to build more sustainable, if not regenerative, symbiotic infrastructure. I am Robert Hanlon, founder of Utility Squared, where we connect communities to their infrastructure, driving collaborative development strategies with our neighbors as primary stakeholders. The mission of Infrastructure Week and our nonprofit is to accelerate transformative ecological change in the infrastructure evolution. United for Infrastructure, we can accelerate equitable development strategies for the urban environment. We are amidst a historic moment of federal infrastructure investment with the Americans' Job Plan. Make no mistake, our nation is lagging in the global context of sustainability, equity, and investment in the urbanized environment, ranked 13th globally, even though we are technically the wealthiest nation. 2021 of the human era is the biggest year for infrastructure in decades, and more importantly, the recognition of environmental justice for so many communities. At IW, we recognize the systemic injustices and failures of our present infrastructure, proceeding forward with community as that primary stakeholder. And while political shenanigans leave much to be determined about the American Jobs Plan and what happens, we would like to acknowledge all the advocates and social activists bringing us to this historic pivot. Professionals like ASCE, American Society for Civil Engineers, driving investment towards improving city infrastructure. You can see here Washington's 2019 report card for infrastructure. Washington received the C in 2019, which was its best grade since they've been running this program. It kind of tells you why we need this investment. We also want to give thanks to professionals and presenters on this call for providing awareness of regional projects. We want to give gratitude for Black Lives Matter, a global movement awakening many of us to the reality of BIPOC communities and injustices endured. And organizations like Front and Center and Got Green, who have been crucial in passing the Healthy Environments for All Act, otherwise known as HEAL Act, here in Washington. Through pandemic, historic moments like this, we must take pause to understand our individual impact and begin a better normal, a just normal, which learns from our past to build for tomorrow. It is our individual responsibility to see a sustainable evolution of society realized, designers to create enable regenerative facilities, engineers to create novel yet equitable solutions, city leaders advocating for resilient communities, and an aware and engaged general public holding accountability. And this is Infrastructure Week. So we have to start off with the definition to really help us rethink infrastructure. It is the organizational framework and fundamental structures and facilities needed for the operation of a society or enterprise, in this case, an entire nation full of cities. Keywords there is framework and facilities. This is both physical assets and the policy governing them. We have three main, kind of groupings that comprise infrastructure, starting with our primary components. The rail, road, ports, many of the things that we have on our word cloud, municipal utility services and infrastructure, and that governance managing them. I like to call this the billion-dollar bunch. These are very expensive assets. They take years, if not decades, to plan and build. There are technically 16 critical infrastructure sectors that are deemed imperative to national security and its endurance. We have our secondary elements, places where people live, neighborhoods, housing, apartments, places where people have fun and get their entertainment, sports, music venues, shopping with small businesses. And my favorite, if you couldn't tell by my surroundings, is green spaces, parks and recreations, and that natural environment, healthy ecosystems. These are things that are much easier to build and fun. Typically, tens of thousands, 100,000s, maybe several million. And at our Friday event, where we host youth leaders from several major cities, we actually discuss how these smaller investments can create access to features like parks and recreations, often have the biggest impact on their success. Now, lastly, but most important, is our impactful features Our geological and environmental constraints, things like our shoreline, riverfront, seismic considerations when it comes to building. We also need to take into account the local culture of our city, preserving its history, unique urban ethos, so not every city is homogeneous, and understanding the economic conditions of past, present, and our future industry and employment. So thank you to our MUSE workforce, especially in these trying times, for keeping our municipal utility services doing what they do. Now, this event is for community and infrastructure professionals, but we really want to highlight the role of community. And just like having too many cooks in the kitchen can be a little stressful, adding more stakeholders to large projects can also be a challenge. And while increased public engagement can be seen as a burden to developers, designers, and builders, these projects truly shape the city and health of its people for generations. So we must start to think about infrastructure legacies and elevate community and environment as primary stakeholders in repairing or building new infrastructure. And it brings us to this term to familiarize ourselves with, a theme I use quite often in these conversations. Modernity, which is a dynamic concept of comparative socioeconomic status and the desire to remain at the forefront of progression. Process of questioning our present state and seeking improvement to what is considered modern. From this point forward, we frame our perception of infrastructure around this concept. And when we combine this thinking in context with the human era at large, we can better understand the 12,000 years humans have lived among the built environment. Through the millennia, the Earth has bared witness to two fundamental generations of infrastructure. Also recognizing that the last 600 years of infrastructure has been controlled by monotheist, cisgender, straight, and often white or westernized male perspectives. So let's take a look at the human era and what previous societies have accomplished in terms of infrastructure. Here we have a calendar of the human era. I'm going to run through this quickly, but the idea here is we capture 10,000 years of societal evolution that's otherwise not really thought of when we just look at the Gregorian calendar. Year zero essentially marks are the oldest known human infrastructure built, Göbekli Tepe, the oldest temple on Earth. Before this time, Earth was really coming out of the Ice Age. Humanity was a rather nomadic species, hundreds of thousands of years with no hard infrastructure, at least any that we had found or dated previous. Starting at year zero, though, marks that first infrastructure, along with stone tools, evidence of farming, and a lot of migration as the Ice Age receded. The agricultural revolution was a huge step, bringing forth the Bronze Age, writings, the wheel, advanced metalwork, and widespread trading of these novel technologies. Around this time is when many monotheist religions believed the world was in fact created, but also when many notable high cultures formed around the world, increasing populations, spawning that first generation of city infrastructure, water networks, economies, and governance. However, a lot of these high societies simply vanished in what was known as the Great Disappearance through war, natural disasters, and a lot of uncertainty. After the Dark Ages, moving closer into the present, the Renaissance created more robust Gen 1.5 infrastructure, if you will, with humanity sailing into a new era once Europeans reached Americas, now we call colonization. And you can see how quickly we move into the present, with new horizons emerging as populations grew rapidly in the 19th century in what was called mega cities, something the world has never seen before, most notably in London and New York, which led to this need for improved infrastructure, more systems thought, more technology, and really demanding increased external resources. This eventually leads to World War I, World War II, massive conflicts, the problems we face today. But really, reviewing the last 12,000 years shows our recent exponential growth and the effects that humans have had in less than 2% of the human era. Just a few things to take a look at over these 12 years is our human progression, which is obviously going up at an exponential rate. But let's take a look at human culture. You know, it's kind of gone up, it's gone down. With that great disappearance, what knowledge was lost? And proceeding through colonialism, what was kind of homogenized in this, growth through travel? But really, let's look at ecological health. We know that we are paving over much of the world. I'll show some stats in another slide, but it's something to be conscious of. Even though we've had new technology and all of this, we are affecting the world with our present set of infrastructure. So now we arrive here in this state of modernity, or so we think, right? We can rejoice with the modern conveniences that these 12,000 years of infrastructure evolution has brought us. We'll be covering all this later in different IW events, the specific sectors and what it means. But the point is, like, we're good, right? We have toilets, we have water, we've got roads. But to be honest, not much has changed in the last 100 years in terms of infrastructure. While humans recently flew a drone autonomously on Mars, back on Earth, we're continuing to boil water to create electricity. We bury millions of tons worth of useful resources, spending a large portion of our lives commuting, navigating potholes, and allocating 3 orders of magnitude more on national defense than humanitarian aid. There's also this looming issue of anthropogenic climate change that Generation 2 infrastructure has been pretty much responsible for creating. So why do we need a Green New Deal or an American jobs plan? Let's take a look at our recent history, right? Last 100, 200 years. Returning to these perspectives, from early colonists to present day engineers, the predominant thinking of, again, white male majority leadership has been to cut, straighten, and fill the natural environment. We're essentially boxing in nature in an effort to control it. Seattle was founded in 1852. It became one of the most engineered cities in the world. And you could see from 1875 to present, we covered up and filled much of the beauty that was this natural environment. So what's been this cost? It's estimated that since colonization of North America, we've lost between 60 to 85% of its natural wetlands, primarily due to agriculture and infrastructure expansion. Now, wetlands are, in fact, the hotspot for biodiversity and where Earth carries out most of its natural processes. So we must embody history in our effort to build a better future. We as consumers and global leaders must seek to end the continued abuse and exploitation of the natural environment. And I do believe that we can use investment towards sustainable symbiotic infrastructure as a platform. We do want to acknowledge that we're gathered on the unceded land of indigenous peoples. No matter where we're coming from, these lands were claimed and redeveloped into their present shape, often by foreign colonizers, through documented exclusions and erasures of many indigenous peoples. I ask that everyone everywhere acknowledges this truth, respecting present and future cultural preservation, indigenous, Duwamish, and Coast Salish communities here in Seattle, and in numerous other groups throughout America. So let's hold space for the countless cultures and earthly wisdom lost not through things like the Great Disappearance, but also legacies of colonialism. Last thing I'll touch on here is, we have modernity's problem scope and a challenge that we all face together. We need to remember that we are in it together. Most critical for this infrastructure evolution is to address environmental racism and classism, the disproportionate impact of environmental hazards on people of color and low-income communities. These include institutional policies, corporate decisions that deliberately target certain communities for locally undesirable land uses. Lax enforcement is a big one of zoning and environmental laws, resulting in these communities being exposed to toxic and hazardous waste, truly based upon race or economic status. I'll post a link on the environmental justice disparities map from Front and Center for more detail. The point is here, environmental justice and community-based solutions must be center stage when both planning and building new infrastructure. After all, the process of construction itself is in many ways a contributor to these issues. So you see these other, these are common in headlines now, right? But we got to move beyond the limitations of Generation 2 infrastructure to address these large, massive challenges. So what does sustainable infrastructure evolution look like? For utility squared and our ideas, it is the idea of symbiosis for Gen 3. Having an interconnected system for both municipal utility services, and the community served. It may include decentralization of traditionally consolidated processes, turning waste streams into viable products through investments, and radically changing our perception towards circular economies and corporate stewardship. At its core, however, the idea is a long-term design in the creation of symbiosis cities, a holistic and inclusive approach to sustainable city development that transforms urban challenges into opportunities. And Infrastructure Week, our presenters, everything that you'll hear over the next week, it's here to remind us that the future is truly up to us as professionals, consumers, and neighbors. So think about the human era and extent of impact we've had in the last 212,000 years, and what the next 50, 500, or 5,000 years will look like if we continue to choose that extractive status quo over investment towards symbiosis and strong infrastructure. Just a little thing to think about: reflective versus automatic decision making. Again, let's think about the things we do, because it is about choices, and it doesn't just affect us; it affects generations to come. Again, I'm happy to have everybody here. I'm even happier to welcome our guests. We have some awesome speakers. I'm going to start off with Mr. Anthony Kane, President and CEO of Institute for Sustainable Infrastructure. They are the leader in bringing forth the framework for the infrastructure evolution. I highly encourage after this presentation to take a look and read up. But this is, LEAD takes it at the building level. ISI Envision really takes it to that city, that regional level. Anthony, as president and CEO, oversees ISI's operations, does a lot of events. I've tuned into a lot. These projects are awesome. Leads the development of this Envision framework for sustainable infrastructure. And you're also the commissioner for Washington, D.C.'s Commission on Climate Change and Resiliency, which is a huge component of the framework. So I welcome you, and as I do this transition, I know there's been a lot of notable projects, but one in particular that might be your favorite.
Well, I think recently we were very excited to have the California High-Speed Rail, which is the largest infrastructure project in the country at $80 billion, and obviously the first major high-speed rail project in the country. So that was very exciting. But I would say it's not just the kind of big flashy projects. We have some wonderful small ones, small community parks that do stormwater treatment as well. And so I really like the multi-benefit projects that are community amenities, but also providing basic services. So I'm going to start by saying I'm having a little bit of a technical hiccup. I'm still not able to share my slides. It's telling me that the security settings don't allow it. So I'm going to suggest that maybe I just have a conversation and talk through the concepts, if that's all right with you, Robert, and maybe I'll hold the slides for next time.
Perfectly. We get through technical glitches all the time.
Sometimes you just have to roll with it, right? This used to happen back in the day too, right? The slides don't work, so you just talk. So I'm really happy to be here. As Robert mentioned, I'm with the Institute for Sustainable Infrastructure. So we are a 501c3 nonprofit that was created through a collaboration of three major associations: the American Society of Civil Engineers, the American Public Works Association, and the American Council of Engineering Companies. And they really charged us with answering that question of what is sustainable infrastructure? How do we measure it? How do we define it? And so we partnered with the Zoffness program at Harvard University to create Envision. And Robert was very kind to say this is the leading framework, certainly in the US and Canada right now. We're one of only a few systems in the world specifically addressing sustainability of infrastructure. And really our mission as an organization is to be a hub. So we're a hub of over 230 AEC companies, 120 government agencies, several dozen universities. We try to bring together the infrastructure community as a whole, cross-disciplinary, and to identify where there are opportunities where shared resources, consensus building, common cause will produce more efficiency, more effective solutions, And then we try to be the facilitators of that. So that was the genesis of creating the Envision framework. And we're really, again, as Robert has already identified, we're in a nexus right now. We have a number of important issues that we need to address. We're on the cusp of our aging infrastructure, much of which was developed after World War II for several decades. It's reaching its 70 to 80 year lifespan. It needs to be either significantly refurbished or replaced. And we are on the cusp, hopefully, of a massive infrastructure bill and massive infrastructure investment. At the same time, we know we have to tackle climate change, resilience, equity and social justice, environmental protection, public health, economic recovery. And even at $2 trillion, there's not enough money to take a one problem, one solution approach. So every dollar that we spend has to be tackling multiple problems at the same time. And as Robert already identified them, tapping into community causes, addressing historic racial injustices, all of these things have to be done at the same time. And so tools like Envision help us. They give us the framework to navigate those complex trade-offs, to translate those very big ideal goals into a very practical application for our day-to-day, and to demonstrate consistency and accountability so that every dollar that we spend, we know is being used, to the utmost benefit. And that's really our goal. And you might say, well, that's all very nice, sounds fun, idealistic, but how do you know any of this is going to work? Well, there is a model. And again, Robert already alluded to it. We saw in the building sector with the advent of systems like LEED, while they are themselves rating systems, their true value has been in transforming their industry. So with LEED, we saw a transformation of universities and academic curriculum. Sustainability is now embedded in the profession of architecture. Third-party accountability and reporting. We've learned and escalated over the years. Agencies that maybe started with LEED certified or LEED silver have inched their way up to LEED gold or LEED platinum. We've seen cascading requirements from the federal government down to state and local levels. Market transformation from how we design, how we construct, even how products are manufactured, and the willingness of product manufacturers to disclose information. And it has, as I mentioned, had a transformation on the professional practice itself. And it has facilitated the rapid scaling of sustainability efforts in the built environment. So the great news is this has been done before. It's kind of proven. And I feel like we in the infrastructure industry really love when something's been done before and proven. And so we need to do this for ourselves. We need to do this for infrastructure. We need to do this for the future, as was already pointed out. We have to change the way we're practicing. I think even more so, because while we've heard about the decade of action that we're having to be in, I think that's a general term for the world, but not for our industry. Our industry builds things that last 80 years. We need to start now. When people start talking about what's the world going to be like in 2050 or 2100, we know what it's going to be like. We're building all of that stuff, and it's still going to be around. It's different for computer manufacturers or soda bottle manufacturers, where they're coming out with a new product every year, or the lifespan of a soda bottle is 6 months. Again, our lifespan projects are 70 years or more if you're talking about bridges. Some of our stuff never goes away. So we have an obligation to be thoughtful, especially thoughtful in how we look to the future and how we plan for the future. So that's really the goal of Envision, to provide this framework, to provide this common language, because it's too much to tell someone, know everything, about all of these different challenges, and reinvent it every single time that you step into a project, right? We need these tools, we need these things that will become frameworks for us and how we work. And Envision is really intended to apply to all different types of infrastructure. It's one of its strengths as well. So we're not siloing out certain project types. We're not making it more complicated with dozens of different systems. It's one system to apply to all infrastructure. And we feel that that's a huge value, as well as a value outside of our industry as we represent what we do to the general public. Because the general public has a hard time understanding the complexity of infrastructure and the challenges and the limitations. And often what they see is it's like an iceberg. It's a small fraction of what the project is itself. So we have an obligation to do a better job communicating what we do. And again, frameworks like this help us do that. Communicating with the public what we're doing, listening to the public, understanding what their needs are, and communicating how we are meeting those needs. So that's a very important part of infrastructure as well. The system itself, I'll just go through briefly. It's made up of a number of different components, but the heart and soul of it is really the Envision manual. And I would encourage you to go to our website, sustainableinfrastructure.org. You can create a free account and download the whole thing for free. It is also, we have a self-assessment checklist. We have a professional credential and training program. And we have a third-party verification and review award program, with the very common silver, gold, platinum levels of awards. And I'll talk about some of the projects as well. And it covers 5 categories of sustainability broken out into 64 indicators. So we look at quality of life, which is our community aspects, leadership, which is collaboration, planning, economic impacts, resource allocation, which is your materials, energy, and water, natural world, which are your environmental impacts, and climate and resilience, which is both our preparedness for climate change and our mitigation to climate change as we go forward. And it really tackles all of those issues that I mentioned at the start, right? That we as a nation, we need to tackle public health, we need to look at equity and social justice, we need to look at economic recovery, climate change, and resilience. And all of that is covered in the 64 indicators of Envision. And a great thing about it is it doesn't just draw a line in the sand and say on one side you're sustainable and on the other side you're not sustainable. We know sustainability is a spectrum. We should always be striving to do better. We don't just cross the line and stop. So Envision on all of its credits has 5 levels of achievement that we break out, and you work your way up through those levels. And it helps you see the full range of possibilities on your project. The levels go from improved up to enhanced, superior. The 4th level is conserving, which would be sort of a net zero or no impact, no negative impact level. And then we even go to restorative, because we can do better than just no negative impact. Oftentimes infrastructure can have a positive impact on either the environment, society, the economy. We have that ability, and we need to be striving towards that, even if we can't achieve it on every single project. And as I mentioned, I think the greatest value of Envision is in providing that common language. Infrastructure is incredibly complex. Sustainability is incredibly complex. We have numbers of different subdisciplines, companies, public agencies, all working on projects for many years. We have to be able to speak the same language and know what we're talking about when we refer to these very important issues like equity and social justice. We need something that guides us through those conversations, that gives us a point of reference, a shared point of reference, to help us be successful when we do that. And we're very proud. We feel like we have been successful. There are over 6,000 active credentialed professionals right now, predominantly in the US, but also in several other countries. We've third-party verified over $100 billion worth of infrastructure, and that represents about 110 projects all throughout the United States, and several in the Seattle area, which I'm really excited about. We've done a lot of work there, specifically with sound transit. And so I know there's another speaker coming in from WDOT. So sound transit has been a great example where they've really adopted Envision and embedded it into their sustainability plan, largely for the education component of it. So while it is a rating system, I think one of the great values of it is just a training and education plan. And so we see that being used quite frequently. And we see Envision being embedded at multiple different levels, from state legislation all the way down to design guidelines. And I'll run through just a few in the interest of time. But right now it's really exciting. In California, we have a bill, SB 44, that's going through that will streamline the judicial review process for projects that meet Envision. And so this is really exciting because we want to make sure that environmental regulations and controls are in there to prevent bad projects. But we also want to incentivize good, environmentally positive projects. And one of the ways you can incentivize them is in streamlining this review process and speeding them up. So we think that's a really exciting development. We've seen resolutions at the city and county level. So in Miami-Dade County, there's a resolution adopting Envision. Similarly, the city of St. Petersburg in Florida has an ordinance requiring Envision on all projects. And that just makes sense when you think of all the communities in the country that have requirements that buildings be sustainable or meet some kind of sustainability standard. very few have the same for infrastructure. And infrastructure is the other half of our built environment. And we aren't going to achieve the goals that we want to achieve if we're ignoring 50% of our built environment. We also see it tied to grant funding. So in California, the California Department of Water Resources has a great program where they recognize as a state agency that's tasked with regulating, this is the Flood Management Division, they see the benefit to the state when projects achieve multi-benefits across sustainability, right? So even though they're tasked with a very limited view, what they've done is increased their grant funding by 5% or 10% on a project based off of whether they achieve Envision Gold or Envision Platinum. I think it's a very smart way for government regulatory bodies that might be limited in their scope for whatever reasons, but recognize the efficiencies and the benefit to the state and the people of the state when projects take a more comprehensive view and aren't just focused on one regulation or meeting one goal. And so I think that was a really smart one. And we also see it in RFPs and things like that. An exciting one that I would encourage everyone to do is the New York State Department of Design and Construction, which handles all of New York State's activities or construction activities, used it as a gap analysis. So they had a sustainability plan for 15 years prior to this, but they used Envision to look and see how their sustainability thinking matched with a consensus-driven national standard like Envision, and were able to identify where they were doing well and where they could do better. And then the last really quick example I'll give recently is the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. They had a system of sustainability guidelines for infrastructure that predated Envision. But what they realized was over the years, and this was just a couple last year, that over time they would have to keep updating this, right? They'd have to keep updating their sustainable guidelines. They didn't have the resources to develop training programs or additional resources or community of practice. It was really just a manual that they would hand their staff and say, follow this, right? And they were in the position of having to update it, and they realized, well, why should we devote all of these resources? Envision is out there. They just adopted Envision, tacked on a 20-page kind of addendum, modifying it for their purposes, and moved on. And their justification was, well, with Envision, they get, as I mentioned, the training program, their staff can go through the education, they have access to continuing learning exercises, resources, and they become part of this national community of practice, which they didn't have before in their custom design guidelines that were unique to their agency. And that really is what success looks like to us as an organization. That's why we exist, for that story, which is, the Port Authority, which is a multi-billion-dollar agency, doesn't have the resources to develop educational content and training for some of these things. What are the chances of all the other smaller communities being able to do that? And if ISI can provide those shared resources and to develop those, we're sort of, for the good of the order, advancing the cause in our own way and allowing those agencies to spend their money and resources on actually achieving sustainability, not just to developing sustainable tools. So with that, I apologize again for the technical difficulties without my slide, but sometimes I actually like it when you don't have to present slides. It feels, even in a digital format, it feels a little bit more personal, and I can just talk to people and you can just look at me. So I would encourage you, please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about Envision or ISI. Again, our website is sustainableinfrastructure.org, and you can download the manual there for free and kick the tires and see how you like it. So thank you again for having me, and I look forward to the rest of the event tonight.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. I did put a link for the Envision guide, and as you mentioned, I think the most powerful aspect of the Envision is anybody could go in and read that framework and become immediately familiarized with what you're trying to do with this idea of sustainable infrastructure, regenerative, equitable infrastructure, the steps that need to be taken. It's all there. And the huge benefit is, the municipalities don't have to do that legwork, 100,000 times over, because it's well established. And you guys continually come out with, new versions as new technologies, methods, best management practices come available, right?
Absolutely. We're currently on Envision version 3. and we update it as we come across. A big one being, several years ago when we started Envision version 3, the renewed interest in resilience, right? And we knew we had to beef up our resilience section, so we're constantly adapting it. Interestingly, also in the resilience section, this was years ago, we added specifically in resilience considerations for things like pandemics, which has unfortunately been something that we're dealing with now. So you're right, we're constantly learning, we're constantly gaining new knowledge and trying to predict what are the things we should be looking out for. And we try really hard to write it in a way that is universally understandable, right? So we try to cut out the jargon, we try to make it as clear as possible, succinct as possible, so that anyone can use it in a very easy way.
We do have a question from Brianna. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, Brianna.
Hey, yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, I was curious if there are any grant funding sources or incentives here in Washington State to use this Envision program.
I've not been made aware of them, but to be fair, people don't always tell me. So sometimes Envision just gets embedded in things, but I'm not aware of any specifically. Like I said, I am aware that King County is a big adopter of Envision and Sound Transit, as well as there's a work group that we have led by some people from the Washington State Ferries group. And it is actually a work group of port facilities all along the West Coast. So there's Portland, Vancouver, Long Beach, San Diego, I believe, and the Washington State Ferries group. So there are a few kind of Envision hubs based in the Seattle area, and we do have a couple Envision rated projects in Seattle, but I'm not aware specifically of the funding.
Okay, thank you.
And we will be sharing the Ship Canal Water Quality Improvement Project, which is ongoing. Very excited to see how that turns out. Thank you, Anthony. I think we will transition to a bit more of transportation, right? I think this is what a lot of people think of. When I get asked this question all the time, the first thing, roads and bridges. So I want to introduce infrastructure legend, Mr. Roger Miller, with the Washington State Secretary of Transportation. He's coming from Olympia, Washington, not only trained as an ordinary seaman and is qualified to serve as crew on a Washington State ferry, but Roger has served on numerous infrastructure-related boards. There are a lot to mention, but being on 2 boards myself, it's a lot of effort, and I could only imagine. I listened to one of your presentations a while back for ASCE. I was very impressed. A question came up about infrastructure legacies, and I think you nailed it. I think we have the proper person at the helm of a lot of these boards, and excited for you to see your work. So you oversee an agency that is a steward of complex multimodal transportation systems, responsible for ensuring that people and goods move safely and efficiently. Let me go ahead and hand this off to you.
It was great to see Anthony. Until recently, I was on the board of ASCE and actually participated on the team that developed 4 of those infrastructure report cards over the years, the national ones. So glad to see that they're still making a difference. So wanted to talk about opportunities before us here in Washington State. How Washington families and Washington businesses invest in the DOT and maybe the return on that investment. What transportation really costs Washington taxpayers, and a way we can make investments in transportation infrastructure that may reduce the overall cost burden to Washington families and Washington businesses by spending a little bit more in our space, and how that really is a unique opportunity. So our legislature, it's important. I am Secretary of Transportation. I run a organization with about 7,000 employees. There are 2 things I don't do. I do not appropriate funding, and I do not set policy. That is done by the Washington State Legislature. My boss, Governor Inslee, makes recommendations to the legislature, but the executive's job is to implement what the legislature comes up with. So our ledge has worked hard to balance a lot of competing needs for limited transportation dollars, but we really have a lot of opportunities ahead of us to do some important stuff, to save lives, to meet our commitment to fish passage, to ensure our system is in a state of good repair, to address justice and equity and diversity and inclusion, to meet the challenge of climate change and prepare for that inevitable Cascadia subduction zone earthquake while we're moving our economy. So the ledge provides direction, and we provide information in support of its decision-making process, and we implement the decisions they make. So Washingtonians invest a lot of their money in the Washington State DOT. Our annual budget is about $3.5 billion. The operating budget's about $1 billion, split roughly 50-50 between operating the ferry system and operating and maintaining the highway system. And our capital budget is the money we use to build stuff. And what do Washingtonians get for their investment? We are a means to an end. One of those ends is 1.4 million Washington jobs tied to trade, over $500 billion a year in trade traveling on our system. We provide access to quality of life, to work, to school, to shopping, to public health, and access to nature and recreation. And we also provide access to opportunity, particularly for Washingtonians that don't hold a driver's license and Washingtonians who are investing way too much of their money in that combination of housing and transportation. They're cost burdened, and there must be a better way. But when you look at finding room for that better way, people will point out to me, they like to do it, that we already have a high gas tax. It's the 4th highest in the country. It's important to know where that money goes. Back at the turn of the 20th century, in 2000, we had a 20-cent gas tax. 8 cents went to WashDOT to do everything that WashDOT does. 12 cents went to cities and counties for transportation. Since then, we've had 3 big transportation packages. And in 2020, as a result of those packages, 8 cents goes to WashDOT for everything that it does. 12 cents goes to cities and counties. And the other 29.4 cents goes to build a specific set of projects and programs identified in the legislation by the state legislature. So there is a list of projects and a list of programs. And increasingly, because we've been paying for those improvements by selling bonds, we're getting to a place where about 9 years from now, almost half of the gas tax we collect will be going to pay off bonds for projects that have already been built. But when you look at the annual cost of transportation to Washington taxpayers, WashDOT's budget, as big as it is, pales in comparison to the cost impact of congestion on the state's economy, to the cost impact of our facilities not being in a state of good repair. That's close to $8 billion, over $8 billion, and that pales in comparison to the economic consequence of crashes. 540 people die on our roads every year. A couple thousand are maimed on our roads every year. And those are individual tragedies to the families, to the coworkers, to the friends, the relations of those people. But most folks in Washington are convinced of one thing. If they're convinced of anything, they're convinced of this, that they personally are a very good driver. And that crash, it's not going to happen to me until it does. But when you add them all up, the impact to the economy is over 3 times the impact of congestion on the economy. And then we're beginning to track the greenhouse gas impacts. This is a 2015 number. I'm sure the number is much higher, but best I had when I put this together. Convert that all to a gas tax. If you wanted to raise $15 billion a year, how much gas tax would you have to charge? It would be $4.63 a gallon. If you wanted to address the cost to Washington families and Washington businesses of a lack of state of good repair, $1.17. You add this up, we're paying a hidden gas tax, if you will, in terms of a drain on our economy of over $8 a gallon. $8 a gallon that we could be spending on other stuff. So if we actually raised our gas tax or other means of funding transportation and spent that money wisely, invested it in addressing safety, addressing state of good repair, addressing greenhouse, and yes, even addressing congestion, but doing it smartly, maybe we could lower the overall cost to Washington State. So here's a place we could make investment, and that would be preserving the system we've already built. These are kind of sobering numbers. 3,600 lane miles of pavement due for preservation, 4,700 lane miles past due. We pave, our budget provides for paving 750 miles a year. You can do the math, how many years it's going to take to catch up. 12 bridges need replacing, 18 more need major rehab. We have funding for 6. 47 bridges due for painting, 59 past due. We have funding for 10. 63 bridge decks due for repair, 37 past due. 2 are being repaired with the budget that we've been given by the legislature. Our ferries have problems, our short line railroads have problems. And our facilities, 42% of the buildings we manage are more than 50 years old. So we're known as an agency that builds stuff. What we are is an agency that manages a system. We're stewards of a transportation system that has a replacement cost of about $200 billion. And when you own facilities, when you're responsible for facilities, you need to invest in those facilities continuously. You own a car, you own a house, you own a bicycle, you need to keep making investments or those facilities fall apart. We should be spending $1.8 billion a year on state of good repair, preservation work and maintenance work. We spend $890 million. We're deferring to some future date $925 million a year. It's kind of like putting a 20-year asphalt shingle roof on your house with a well-intentioned plan of replacing that 20-year roof in 40 years. At some point, your furniture is going to get wet, and it's getting to be that time here in Washington State. So investment in state of good repair would pay phenomenal returns. Investment in safety would pay phenomenal returns as well. We have a plan, a goal. We don't really have a plan. We have a goal of getting to 0 fatalities by 2030, or target 0. The numbers going the wrong way. And unless we do something significantly different, it's not going to change. We can keep saying we're a target 0 state, but we're more like a target 540 state, unfortunately. So how do you change the trajectory of that line? You do that through education and enforcement and engineering. And we are the engineering side of that. So what about continuing ed for licensed drivers? What about making it tougher to get a license in Washington State? What about electronic enforcement? There are things we could do, but I run the DOT. I don't run the Department of Licensing or the State Patrol. What we can do is take a safe systems approach to our investment. We will make investments that recognize that safety should not be reduced just to move cars faster. You have to do the math. The roads should be designed to encourage safe behavior by everyone using them. That land use decisions should include commitments to investment that safely accommodate the expected demand. We need to focus on vulnerable road users. The transportation system should be invested in to safely accommodate all of us. We need to set speeds that lower the potential for fatalities and injury. We need to provide safe facilities for walking and biking. And we need to use technology to enforce our laws. Traffic was down during the pandemic, crashes went up. The State Patrol clocked an individual in Snohomish County on I-5 going 192 miles an hour. And there have been examples like that all over the state. We have the technology to enforce speed limits and other laws. There are concerns about that technology, and I share those concerns. I do everything I can to protect my civil rights and my privacy and the privacy of my fellow Washingtonians. And I'm also concerned about how equitable are the impacts of electronic enforcement. But we know the cost of the crashes. And what we need to do is we need to sit down around the table, not trying to figure out what the privacy and civil rights and social equity stakeholders want, but sit down with them, because we all want that. And we want a transportation system that isn't killing people. Another place we need to make investment is addressing homelessness. We all need to be a part of the solution. No one at the Washington State DOT believes that under one of our facilities or along one of our highways is a safe, healthy, and normal place to live. I don't think anybody in Washington State believes that, including the people that are living there. And these aren't folks, believe it or not, people don't migrate to Washington State to live under our freeway overpasses. The data that we have indicates that only about 14% of those experiencing homelessness in Washington came from somewhere else. When you see that camp on the side of the road in your community, in your town, 74% of them are your neighbors. They came from the same county they're living in. The other 12% from other places in Washington State. We're doing triage. We are not a social service agency. I do not have behavioral health experts. I do not have drug and alcohol counselors. I do not have law enforcement as a part of my team. We're able to go in after those public servants do their work with the homeless community and clean up. But we don't move people, we don't counsel them, we don't provide them with housing. And until we're doing all of that together, we're going to be continuing to treat the symptoms. So here's a place we could invest that would pay dividends. When we talk about congestion, the single biggest thing we need to do on the congestion front is address the issue of public transportation going forward, because no one is going to be safe until everyone is safe in this system. And everybody assumes that I'll be safe because I didn't ride the bus. Okay, you get downtown, you get out of your car, you get out on the sidewalk, and there are people who did ride the bus, which statistically is not an unsafe place. But the perception is out there. All of the modes of transportation need to be safe, including elevators and hallways and the entrance to the restroom. And we need to get to that place before any of us are going to be safe. The other thing we've seen is that while transit ridership is down, the service workers, the essential people, the people that are key to the prosperity of our economy are the ones using public transportation, and they often live the furthest from our employment centers. So we need, in terms of investment in infrastructure, we need to be thinking about affordable transportation and housing options for working families, not as a social service that we provide for those who can't take care of themselves, but as an economic necessity for the welfare and future of our state. One of the interesting things that came out of the pandemic was telecommuting. We have 7,000 employees. Half of them have been working at home since March of last year because they can. They have jobs where they can work at home. We've been forced to use a technology that we've had for a long time. I'm not presenting to you in person. We're doing this thing. What we found is it works. And the success is driving new thinking on worker expectation and office space requirements. It works, again, for about half of us. And we need to recognize, as we're reveling in this telework transformation, that we've got to remember the men and women who can't because of what they do and make sure they're taken care of too. But it gives us an opportunity to manage demand for the system without adding roadway capacity. It flattens the peak hour. It's certainly been shown to flatten the morning peak commute. A lot of people are, if they do go in, they go in late. It also gives people the opportunity to improve their work-life balance. When we all went home and we surveyed our employees, about a month or two in, 70% of them liked teleworking from home as much or better than working in the office. 8 months later, we surveyed them again, and the number went up. And it's been interesting listening to the stories on NPR and elsewhere as the pandemic appears to be ebbing and businesses are talking about and agencies are talking about going back to work. There are a lot of supervisors who want to be able to look over your shoulder in the office. There are a lot of employees who like what they've got in terms of their flexibility. So this transformation is going to be really, really, really interesting to watch. And one of the things I'm interested in is, does it create an opportunity for us to create jobs in some of our remote communities that have all the bones of community except the big revenue generator? They were built around a mill. They were built around a mine. The mine's not there anymore. The mill's shut down. But the stores are there. The schools are there. The homes are there. What if high-speed internet is there and you can bring wealth into a community by having people that would have otherwise worked in South Lake Union or downtown Olympia living in small town Washington? That brings the importance of complete neighborhoods to play. Complete neighborhoods for everybody, though, not just for rich white people. I live in a complete neighborhood. I can walk or ride a bike to meet all my needs. That's a great thing. That's how I choose to live. I don't have to walk or ride a bike, but I can. A lot of us can't, and that is a problem. And we need to be thinking about how we can help all of us, regardless of our income, regardless of our ability, regardless of our color, to meet their needs without a car. It's a better way of living, and it enables government to do something with your money other than building new and wider highways. One of the things we do need to do is build new and wider sidewalks and bikeways. We just finished an active transportation plan for the state of Washington to catch up on accessibility, to complete the state's active transportation system. We need to spend in excess of $5 billion statewide. But the end result of that would be people being able to get around their communities without driving. They'd be healthier. Our environment would be cleaner for it. And again, every one of those trips not taken in a car, that's more space on the highway for people who need to or choose to drive. Freight mobility is another place we need to make investment. The freight industry delivered, literally, during the pandemic. And the consumer shift to online shopping has accelerated because of COVID. Much of the traffic in the neighborhood during the depths of stay home, stay healthy was package delivery. And they've been by my house a couple times today. So what's the public interest in freight door to door? What and where should any public investment be? What role do things like electric vehicles and e-cargo bikes and the like play in package delivery? Stuff we need to talk about. Another place we can make significant investment that pays amazing returns is something called TSMO, Transportation System Management and Operations, investments in the system to maximize its operational efficiency. Something that everybody loves to hate, particularly on the east side of Lake Washington, is the I-405 express toll lanes. Here's I-5 northbound about 130th. It's a 5-lane facility in each direction. It moves about 105,000 cars a day. Here's I-405 northbound at about 85th. It moves 107,000 cars a day with a 5-lane highway in each direction. But the express toll lanes on I-405, the 2 express toll lanes and the 3 general purpose lanes versus the 4 general purpose lanes and the HOV lanes on I-5 results in us being able to move 35% more traffic volume during the peak hour of the commute. 35% more volume with some cameras and some signs and people that want to ride alone in the express toll lanes paying for it, versus 35% more volume created by adding 35% more capacity to the highway. TSMO saves money and makes our lives better if it's applied right. Another thing we need to look at in terms of investments that pay a return is demand management. Using strategies that are intended to reduce travel demands among modes and times and or routes. By providing those choices, those incentives, we relieve pressure on the traditional transportation system. And then we add capacity. I'm a civil engineer. I like building things, but my job is not to build stuff. My job is to be the steward of a system. And building stuff is something we do after preservation and safety and system management and demand management, after those investments have not been enough. Now, a lot of the stuff we're building was the first choice. Got a problem? Build something. And again, we are doing that work. We have work going on all over the state, adding capacity to the system. There are future things we need to think about. What's the next generation of I-5 from Marysville all the way down to Tumwater? What do we do with high-speed rail? An incredible opportunity in this corridor. What do we do about commercial aviation? And what do we do about that incomplete active transportation system? If we're going to add capacity, we need to look at all the modes to see what makes the most sense for our state going forward, not planning for the future by looking in the rear view mirror, but going forward into the future. And all of these investments, they pay 1 for, 2 for, 3 for, in terms of addressing needs in Washington state. We have a need for resilience. Our system has to be resilient to climate change, to the earthquake, to economic downturns. So state of good repair helps us with our seismic retrofit need. State of good repair helps us with our fish passage obligations. Investing in high-speed rail, hybrid electric ferries are being built to decarbonize our economy. They're also being built to address a state of good repair issue because our boats are old and they cost a lot to maintain and they need to be retired. So we're doing a lot of stuff in the resilience space, and those investments pay a great return. Decarbonizing transportation by preparing for EV charging demand that is coming. They're going to have an electric Ford F-150 pickup truck. Ford announced it today. That will be a game changer. Hydrogen fuel cells and other technologies, as I said, we're converting the ferry fleet. We're converting our transit fleets, and we're converting our transit fleets as the old diesel buses wear out. And we're looking at e-bikes and e-scooters and e-trains and all the rest. We're looking at a lot of technology and innovation being baked into the mix. It's going to be an interesting time. We're also looking at how we make decisions about land use and transportation. We need to be making decisions at a regional or even a mega regional scale. And we need to be thinking about, as local government approves development, what does that do to the transportation network? And as we invest in transportation, what does that do to development opportunity? And how do we blend those to minimize the cost and optimize the choices that we provide Washingtonians going forward? So making all these investments makes sense. Making all these investments also creates jobs. And different kinds of investments create more or fewer jobs per dollar spent. Building new roads creates jobs. Repair work on roads and bridges generates 16% more jobs per dollar spent than new roads. Public transportation generates 31% more jobs per dollar spent than new road construction. Bicycle and pedestrian investment creates up to 50% more jobs per dollar spent because they're labor intensive projects. If we're looking to invest in transportation and we're looking to invest in a 21st century system, as the president's been saying, these are good blue collar jobs that we will be creating as a part of this investment we hope to get a return on. We also need to be committed to racial justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. It's a pillar of my agency's strategic plan. We're committed to an inclusive workforce. We're committed to a diverse workforce. We're committed to spending our business dollars in a diverse way, creating opportunities. We require our contractors to have 15% of the hours worked on their projects be worked on by apprentices. And through pre-apprenticeship support services and other techniques, in Washington State now, 44% of the hours worked by apprentices on our projects are worked by women and people of color. 44%. We're bringing people into the construction trades that traditionally haven't been there. And we need to make sure that we're actively engaged with underserved communities in what we do. I am, as the CEO of WashDOT, on the boards of the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials and the Western Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials. We at WashDOT led, and both of those boards unanimously passed resolutions acknowledging past actions that have disproportionately negatively affected low-income communities, and that the legacy of those actions persists in disparities in society today. We committed to hold ourselves accountable for engaging in advancing racial justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And we've strengthened our commitment to the values claimed in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and seeking to advance these goals in how we do our work. So our work matters on a lot of different levels in terms of investment. So 2021, a unique opportunity to rethink our old models, to work with partners and stakeholders to recommend policy decisions to the legislature, to re-examine how we use our infrastructure, to ensure that our policies and programs are equitable and inclusive, to explore how we work in this modern work environment, how we operate as a system, to look at new and flexible sources of revenue, and to emphasize resilience and flexibility and adaptability as we go forward. So thank you for listening to me. I will now endeavor to unshare my screen. There you go.
Thanks, Roger. That was excellent and very comprehensive. I really appreciate that you brought up, homelessness and displacement at large. It is a community issue that requires action by all of us, whether it's a fellow neighbor or a professional or advocate. I also like that you brought up that idea of complete neighborhoods, that 15 to 20 minute community, and the importance and the role that WashDOT's taking. One question, it's a bit pointed. I guess it's from what I understand, contentious. It seems like we're limited on the application of EVs for long travel because the federal highway doesn't allow, to a degree, private operations like that being an EV charging station. Right, forgive my ignorance on the specifics, but does WashDOT have a stance on putting EV charging stations, on the I-5 or on the interstate?
We've been investing in EV charging stations on the highway system for over a quarter century. We have a lot invested in it. We would love to, most people who own an EV, they're charging their car at home. They're charging their vehicle at home. Various codes, depending on where you live, are requiring them at the office. What we're providing is that security blanket of mid-route or along the route charging stations so that you don't wind up on the side of the road on the flatbed of shame, getting towed home. The problem we have, federal highways is perfectly fine with us building charging stations in the right of way. What they have heartburn with, and it's because of federal law. Again, FHWA doesn't set policy any more than WashDOT sets policy. You can't charge for charging in a rest area because that's a commercial activity that competes with truck stops and gas stations and convenience stores. And the law was written before all of this to prevent rest areas from competing with the interchange with the McDonald's and this and that and the other. The rest area, like the Florida Turnpike, the Jersey Turnpike, those are grandfathered in the system. But here in Washington State, if I wanted to put a charging station in every rest area we have, it'd be fine. We'd have to give it away for free. We don't have the money to do that. The legislature hasn't chosen to do that. There are people who would love to do that and charge people for it, but it's against the law. So that is something we're talking about around the industry. And I think what you'll find is those gas stations and convenience stores and the like are going to start putting these things in too, because we're reaching a tipping point. I'd rather government wasn't involved in it. I mean, we need to help facilitate it. We need to prime the pump. But if you can charge your car while you're at McDonald's versus charging your car while you're at my rest area, I have no problem with that. But there's not a whole lot. I mean, I drive some of our less crowded roads, like State Route 26, going over to Pullman or US 2 east of Wenatchee. There are not a lot of people that are going to invest a lot of money looking for a return on investment in charging infrastructure out there. Those are places where government needs to go.
I was wondering about how you see the MUTCD update play into addressing the safety concerns and kind of that whole correlation of speed and crash and level of service and trying to address that.
That's a great question. The MUTCD is a big part of it, and having the right people around the table, including people who believe in some of the newer techniques of designing for an operating speed versus build it to go 75 miles an hour and then post it 35 and wonder why people are speeding. We're working on that. We're working on a new version of the AASHTO Green Book, the guidelines for highway design. We're working on getting away from the 85th percentile method for determining speed limits, where you set the speed limit by going out and measuring how fast everybody's going, and however fast 85% of people are going, that's the speed. It's like, okay, everybody's speeding, let's reward them by raising the speed limit. We've been working on speed management that has a different impetus and is resulting in different things. The folks in Seattle were really worried when they contacted us and said, we want to reduce the speed limit on several city streets that are also state highways. And we said, bring it in. They brought it in. They talked to us about it. And they had 10 specific instances where they wanted to reduce the speed limit. We were absolutely fine with 7 of the 10. And there was 1 of the 10 that needed a little nudge. And then there were 2 where there was major change happening in terms of light rail station development and the rest. And we thought, why don't we make that change as a part of the change of the environment? But my team, the marching orders, if there are any that they get from me, is our response to change is not no. Our response to new ideas is yes, and yes, we can do that. And here's what we need to do to make it happen. And so we're starting to see that. There are people tied to the MUTCD. There's a group that's got a little ego in that. There's a group of not invented here that are grumpy about it. But there's also a compelling fraction of the traffic engineering community and the human behavior community that are completely open to making these changes. The problem is the pace of change. And again, I get beat up a lot in my job is, why are you building that road? I'm building that road because the people you elected directed me to build that road. I didn't wake up in the mornings, I would go widen the highway. And the people that were elected and told me to do that, they don't do that just, I know, let's widen the highway. They're doing that because that's what they're hearing from their constituents. And our job, my job, is to provide subject matter expertise, not just to the elected officials, but to the people that talk to them. And with the MUTCD, it's the same thing. We need to get the right people around the table. We need to have that conversation. And if there was anything that, like Secretary Pete or the Congress, because let's speed this up. It doesn't take a decade to do this. We could do it a lot faster, as NACTO has demonstrated again and again with the guidance that they bring out. But I'd love to see crosswalks that look like piano keys. I'd love to. Some of the stuff that's going on is really cool, and we get the stink eye from people strictly interpreting the MUTCD all the time, and it's part of it is the standards, and part of it is the willingness to take a little educated risk every once in a while.
But excellent presentation, and really showing just the disparity between revenue coming in and how much work we have ahead of us.
Yep. Thanks. I'll be here.
Roy, go ahead and get your presentation drawn up. I'd like to present Dr. Roy Schiff with SLR International, Principal Water Resources Engineer and Scientist, PhD, NPE, specialized in river and road conflict areas to improve transportation resiliency. Roy attended UW for his master's, lived in Capitol Hill, Ravenna, and Fremont, all great places in the mid-90s. I hear that you miss the trees, the big rivers, and salmon in Washington. I hear you. I was very fortunate to see migrating orcas during my mom's visit a few weeks back. Amazing sight, truly emotional. So go ahead and take it away.
All right, thanks a lot. Can you hear me okay, Robert?
We can hear you.
Okay, great. Let me share my screen here. And can you give me an okay if the slides look all right?
We're good.
All right. Yeah, and I guess the unique part is I actually live in Vermont. That's why, having spent a lot of time in Seattle in the 90s for grad school, yeah, it's great to be a part of this. So it was really interesting talks. The Vermont Agency of Transportation is really getting invested in resiliency, and the reason is very similar to some of the reasoning we heard for the investments, is that is our number one damage mechanism to our highways, our flooding, from inland rivers as a landlocked state and along Lake Champlain. So the state took a proactive approach. Yeah, I'm going to share a case study that we've been speaking with to many DOTs in our region and around the state. Before I get started, I do want to acknowledge on the upper left Joe Segali of the Vermont Agency of Transportation, who led this project, worked with the legislature and the executives at VTrans, and had the vision to do resiliency planning. And this is the team I'm presenting. It was a large collaboration with several consulting firms on the East Coast. And we won a bunch of awards, ACEC, TRB, NEARC, for it's a GIS-based tool, and some geodat science in the bottom right here. So it's been nice to have some folks interested in the tool. And if you want to dig a little deeper, Esri just wrote an article about the tool I'm presenting to you, and you can search it, and there's a user story online. So let's go across the country to the state of Vermont. It's about 9 o'clock here now. And this is the areas where we've developed the Transportation Resilience Planning Tool, otherwise known as the TRPT. We're currently in phase 3 of the project. We're going to build out the tool for the entire state of Vermont. Right now, about 20% is covered. On the right here, I show the state of Washington, 7 times larger, a lot different ecosystems with the arid east and the tropical wet, the rainforest on the west. So a little different, a little more diverse. However, some of the major issues of river flooding exist. And so I think there's some overlap. And it's really exciting to be here to talk with you, because you all put out some climate resiliency papers in the early 2000s that were some of the driving information and methodology that went into this tool development. So I'm going to dig into the tool, and our vulnerability arises out of inundation, which is probably the least common, the most commonly perceived hazard from a river, but the least we see in Vermont. And we really see a lot of erosion. This is one of our state highways that crosses the Green Mountains, and you're looking at a washout. I remember this is after Tropical Storm Irene went through our region with extensive damages, and we were in a car, and my colleague at the state said we're going to go see a culvert washout, and I was shocked to see miles of roadway damaged. And so we have major erosion hazards in our mountain and submountainous terrain in Vermont. But probably the hidden beast we see is deposition, which causes our rivers to jump their track, avulse, and damage our state highways. And this is US Route 4, the Roaring Brook in the Killington area, where the highway was built across a small alluvial fan. So a few definitions I'll be talking about: vulnerability, the extent that an asset is exposed from a threat such as inundation, erosion, and deposition. Probability is the likelihood that a threat will be damaged of storms of different sizes. And we looked at a 10-year flood, a 50-year flood, and a 100-year flood. And criticality, how important is the transportation asset, and risk is the combination of the two. And so we built on a lot of federal highway and other transportation agency work and put a tool together in Vermont. And these are some of the damages we see. On the left is a smaller 10-year flood, bridge clogs, overtopping, and on the right are minor local damages. And this is the same bridge in 2011. We had a 50-year flood where the road was destroyed, debris clogging. This bridge is now in the process of being replaced. So what are the goals of this project? Well, we were looking to systematically identify roads, bridges, and culverts vulnerable to flood and erosion damages, create a pool to pinpoint critical locations, as well as to develop mitigation options, and display this all in a readily accessible web-based application. And at the end of the talk, I'm going to run through the web-based application to show you. And so here, again, adopted from FHWA and WSDOT at 2005, naming convention for the types of road failures. And we've set up parameters for timing, the intensity of the damage, and the length of the damage, and how long it took to recover. So we have partial closure, full closure, temporary failure, and complete failure. Here's a couple photos. Upper left, minor shoulder damage, temporary closure. In the middle, we have a temporary closure once the floods recede, back in action. On the right, some, again, minor damages. Bottom left, we had a partial failure where one lane was accessible after the flood, and then bottom right, complete failure, weeks to months before roads are back in action. Now, I'm not going to dig too deep into the method development, but I want you to know that in Vermont we have stream geomorphic data, where we have field data on over 2,000 miles of rivers of our 20 plus some odd thousand-mile river network. And so we're able to use this data. We also use the FEMA flood data on our structures collected by VTrans, as well as others, regional planning commissions. So we had a good data set, and then we developed GIS data to define the vulnerability for inundation, erosion, and deposition. And so a quick note on the vulnerability. And this scale, again, was adapted from WSDOT and Federal Highway. And if you can see, we have low to high vulnerability moving up the scale. And when we have inundations of different sizes, we can get to partial closure or full closure. So really, you can see on the scale from 0 to 10 on the right, with a 10 being a complete failure, that it's really our erosion or deposition that really can wipe out our assets. Again, we're focused on road, embankment, bridge, and culvert. And so we developed, up to 29 vulnerabilities: road, bridges, and culvert, inundation, erosion, deposition, and for 3 storms. Quick example of the vulnerability screening. So this is an example for culvert vulnerability due to erosion, and we looked at documented past damages, the percent bankfill width, so how large is that culvert relative to the channel size, the slope of the structure relative to the channel, erosion, and armoring. And these are screening variables that have been shown that when they match the channel the best, the likelihood of damages to your structure are the lowest. And so we've scaled these based on different size floods, calibrated them in the field based on our many years of flood damages, and then created a 0 to 10 scoring system. So we have this for, again, for each of the processes, the river processes, as well as each of the assets. Oops. And wanted to just share, there's a lot of data behind this. This is a plot of the right-of-way length that's in the river corridor, the area where the river is most likely to meander. And the scatter plot on the left shows areas where there were no damages. There have been no damages recorded. And then the second one over is partial closure. Then we have a full closure and then temporary failure. And what we learned was 1/8 of a mile to 1/4 mile. We had, some of the failures, and then we had more failures when there was over 1/4 mile down in the river corridor. And so we used plots like this to sort of calibrate our scoring system. We went out after developing the TRPT on 3 pilot watersheds and had to make adjustments of about 5% in our pilot watersheds, meaning we just missed the vulnerability. Either the GIS data or the field data were off, or we reassessed the damage data. We had to interpret damage data that came out of the Agency of Transportation. So we're going to shift gears here and move on to the criticality and how important is the asset to traveling. And this is really one of the unique aspects of this project, where we evaluated failed trips, excess travel time in isolated areas or islands in the network based on transportation modeling. We also looked at emergency services and local importance. And so the Network Criticality Index developed by Smart Mobility really operates under this principle. And the blue lines represent low vulnerability, and the orange lines represent high vulnerability. So we're looking at redundancy of routes here. So in the upper left, you have 2 low vulnerability routes. So the criticality is lower. If one of these were to fail for some reason or another, you're able to get by on a second route. On the right, however, you have a high criticality, meaning you have no parallel route and it's highly vulnerable. The bottom left, you have one of each, which means you have moderate criticality. One is highly vulnerable, one has a lower vulnerability, and if that fails, the high vulnerability, you have one route. And then really this approach is novel because it identifies if you have 2 highly vulnerable routes, then you have high criticality still. And this typically isn't considered in transportation modeling. So what we did was, when we developed our vulnerability estimates, we put those into our network criticality index. So we put it in our state travel demand model and ran roughly 3,000 simulations to break the transportation network based on that vulnerability, to really understand the fragmentation of our system during flood and erosion events. At the same time, we looked at a University of Vermont tool called the Critical Closeness Accessibility Index, which identifies how close you are to an essential service such as hospital, shelter, food, and the importance of that road to access essential services. And finally, we gauge the for local importance. How important is a road for detours when there's flooding or for daily function? So if it didn't get clicked positive for critical index or closeness to a important service, we flagged it for local importance. So we put both of those together, and I added this. This is from a WSDOT manual that came out in 2011, and we actually really like this presentation of criticality on the horizontal axis and impact on the vertical. And we tweaked it a little bit. We have vulnerability on the horizontal and criticality on the vertical, and low to high risk, which we took as the average of these 2 values. And this is on the web application. You can zoom around. And then we developed a algorithm to identify a list of mitigation options. So if you knew you're in an erosion prone setting, maybe stabilization is the approach. Or if you're lacking floodplain, developing a floodplain, or even changing some land use in the area. And so here's a couple of mitigation projects as examples. In the upper left corner, I'm standing on a bridge looking upstream in a filled floodplain that was prone to erosional damages, and we restored a floodplain. So when the flood comes down, the river coming at us in the photo on the right, it can spill out and the velocities can slow down and spread out. This project was completed right before Tropical Storm Irene and was reported to possibly save the bridge because it spread the flood flows out. A lot of armors put on the edge of rivers, and here simple things like preserving the bankful channel width by using some different design details really supports resiliency and long-term protection of the roads. So if you want to go access the TRPT, you can look at both the informational page as well as the tool. And I'm going to hop off my slides now and pull that tool up. Robert, can you see this? Oops, might have just clicked a button there. Can you guys see the website?
Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you. So the last few minutes, I just wanted to give you a quick tour. And again, if you wanted to go to, if you search Agency of Transportation and Transportation Resilience Planning Tool, you're able to access this. And there's a user guide in there that gives you the details on a little more detail on the development I wasn't able to cover. But here's the tool. So this is the opening page, and it's sorted by our major basins. We have 16 of those in the state of Vermont. And I'm going to select a basin in the southeast corner of the state. Let's see if waiting a second for it to load. Here it goes. Okay, and I'm going to zoom in. Let's see, this thing is in the wrong spot. Okay. So you can see some pretty straightforward color coding. Green is low risk, orange, medium, and red, high. And in the upper right corner, if you can see that, there's the vulnerability versus criticality plot. And it shows you the distribution of the roads you're seeing on the screen. So you can see right now, there's a lot of different road segments based on our state GIS layer. And I'm going to zoom in. This is Vermont State Highway Route 9 that runs up the Whetstone Brook corridor. And there's been a long history of flood damages in this area. And so I'm going to highlight one of the corridors. And what you see right now is the vulnerability score is a red. It's a 10 out of 10. And if you open the menu, one click, you can see whether it's inundation, erosion, or deposition. And you can see here, it's the deposition. That's the issue. It's got repeat damages. There's a long distance in the corridor, high stream power, and so you have an erosion-prone setting. The criticality is, it didn't pop up as a critical link in the system. However, it's locally important because if it breaks, you have to detour around a very small road. So it's got a criticality that's locally important. And then there's strategies, and you can look at the count here. This is a highly erosive setting. There's really no space in the river corridor for both the road and the river, so we have to do stabilization along the edge. We've actually submitted this project to FEMA for a building resilience community grant, and it was awarded. So there'll be a design to actually protect the edge of the road, but also restore some filled floodplain following some of the flood damage and recovery. And then there's a link to asset information available through VTrans. So the tool has some supporting information. You can change the storm. The 100-year flood is really our sort of future climate change flood. The 50 years is kind of our current large flood, and our 10-year flood is the flood we're actually seeing almost annually right now based on these statistics. So you can pretty much select a different storm. And then likewise, you can add different layers on, put on your bridges and culverts. And then you can look at their resiliency and by zooming in and clicking on them and looking at the information. And then there's a host of background layers. So you can look at a lot of the common river and road GIS data that we use around the state of Vermont. Different watersheds allow you to kind of view the road network vulnerability in context here. So I think with that, I'm getting close to the end of time. I'd stop and see if there's any thoughts or questions.
Yeah, very cool map. I love seeing all the different applications for ArcGIS and ways we can do like visually overlay this. And have you shared your work or done much collaboration in developing the risk assessment with other jurisdictions or other state agencies?
Yeah, so I should have mentioned this, but the work, one of the unique aspects of this work, when Tropical Storm Irene hit Vermont, our state offices were destroyed by a flood. And the result was the Agency of Transportation and Natural Resources landed in the same building and actually ended up collaborating on a whole host of projects, from fish passage projects to resiliency to like developing a rivers and roads training program, and as well as developing the transportation resilience planning tool. So it was quite a collaboration from our agencies of natural resource and transportation that's really set us down a new path. If you have to find a silver lining of a flood, that was certainly one of them. And then at the same time, we've started to export this around the Northeast United States. Massachusetts has developed a rivers and roads training program. With Federal Highway, we did a pilot project to take some of these resiliency indicators and get started. So they have an internal online system. New Hampshire has some stuff going. So like this work is really creeping out, through the pilot project program through Federal Highway, and going to some different agencies.
You mentioned, you're looking to get a project started, but is there, out of that portfolio, what percentage would you say, given our present budgetary constraints, we can attack in, let's say, the next 5 years?
Yeah. Well, it's a great question, and the last talk got me thinking. Yep, really the goal of the TRPT is to help the agency create the prioritization list. So they can only tick off, you saw the numbers for WashDOT. There's only so much budget and so many projects they can tick off. And the trick was, where are those intersections of high risk, where the vulnerability is high? And if these things go down, our transportation system's crippled in an area. And so really the planning bureau in our agency is now out ahead of it using this tool. And like I said, when I started, we'll be wrapping up this tool in the next year for the whole state. So it will really change the corridor planning process and the capital budgeting in the state of Vermont.
And this next one goes to both yourself and Roger, if you're on the call. We see the effects of climate change almost in real time now. Like you said, it's typical to see your 10-year storm as it was a normal storm. How much adjustment, and either you could start, how much adjustment to these models do you think we'll need in the near term to adjust for, what is rapidly changing weather patterns, whether it's rain or just seasonal variations?
Roy, you want to start?
You can go ahead. I'll
Okay. I'll take a very high level. There's a concept called stationarity, that the notion that the underlying assumptions behind our models are static. And I know from my floodplain management work that a lot of the maps that we use to identify that 25-year storm, that 50-year storm, whatever, are early 2000s digitizations of 1980s hand-drawn maps that are based on 1960s hydrology. And as long as we're still working with that base of data, we're going to have these kinds of things happen. And my boss, Governor Inslee, likes to say, we're probably the first generation markedly impacted by the effects of climate change, and perhaps the last generation that can do anything about it. Part of doing something about it is good data and investing in research and investing in the application of that research to things like flood insurance rate maps that are based on 21st century hydraulics and hydrology. And so, but that costs money. It's also infrastructure investment.
I guess the one thing I'd add is, we've started to see states make provisions in their hydraulics manuals, putting out some research across different agencies, and then making design criteria upgrades. So I feel like it's starting to creep into our design approach methods, addressing this, lack of current models and lack of stationarity, so to speak, as Robert said. So yeah, it's a work in progress for sure, but there's now sort of acceptance, I think a little more widespread acceptance for some of these refined design criteria revolving around resilient design.
Mhm.
Yeah, and we're also looking at, where can we get twofers out of stuff, like the work we're doing, the court-ordered work we're doing to address barriers to salmon moving to spawn or moving out to the ocean is the fish passage problem. We're rebuilding hundreds of culverts, and when we do that work, we're doing the hydrologic and hydraulic analysis of each of them. So what today is a 36-inch culvert might wind up being a bridge with a 40-foot span that also has the ability to pass that storm that we're dealing with. And it also has the ability to pass animals like deer and bear and have you under the highway, where before they were up above the highway. So when we're making these investments, to the extent that we can find ways to make an investment that pays a flood impact mitigation return, a fish passage return, an animal crossing return, that's a good thing. But we need to be thinking that way, and we need to be talking about it that way.
Yeah, it's interesting to think, not just build for tomorrow, but later how we're building for tomorrow to accomplish multiple goals and fulfill that future capacity. I've always looked at, I'm a water wastewater guy, and, if you can at least put the piping in place for future expansion, what's that going to mean when that expansion is needed? And likewise, when you're building that culvert, or, what other benefits can you build into it? I find that thought you mentioned about climate change quite disturbing. I never really thought about it. I'm always thinking, I'm on the cusp of the last generation that was before and after during the internet explosion. It's quite frightening to think that our generation is the last one that is going to be able to do something about climate change.
Other than adapt to it. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah, correct. Now, we have just drone technology alone, when you combine with some of the tool sets and, leveraging AR, VR, or, like LiDAR capture in almost real time, has this helped, sort out problematic areas, or is this a tool set that, maybe traditional way of thinking hasn't caught up to that innovative, rapid data set?
I think scientists and engineers are using the technology as adeptly as anyone and in real time, but it's investment in that technology. And then, you can have the technology, you can have the studies, but then you've got the regulations. And, that takes a little bit of time.
Well, I want to be respectful of everybody's time on this call. Either of you have any final thoughts to add to this?
I just wanted to say that, Roy, you got to work with some great people. When I was at Smart Growth America, I worked with Sue Minter and with Joe and with Lucy and the whole team, helped with their state design manual, doing the update to it. So,
oh wow,
the good folks there at VTrans.
Yeah,
and a lot of happy memories from spending time in Montpelier.
Excellent.
I do agree. I actually did my master's at Norwich and had the pleasure of traveling there for the last couple of weeks. And a beautiful state indeed. I am from Northeast Ohio, but Vermont is, I can't wait to see the rest of New England states. Awesome presentations on transportation and transportation resiliency. Again, I encourage everybody to look into ISI Envision if you're not familiar. I'll be posting some links too onto our blog and as to the credentialing process and framework, but very important stuff. You know, we look at, like you mentioned, we're mandating LEED for buildings, yet we don't have a mandatory sustainability criteria, you know, at local, state, or federal levels for infrastructure that's going to be around for 50 plus years, generations. And I want us to think about, you know, when it comes time for that federal tax, gasoline tax to increase, which, correct me if I'm wrong, Roger, 91? Was the
93,
last time?
93.
93. When it comes time for that to get bumped up and at the state levels, let's remember, you know, the proportion that we spend on our everyday life and conveniences, things like haircuts, expensive meals out. I love beer. A 6-pack of beer is double what I pay in terms of tax filling up a vehicle. Let's just put these things in perspective. You know, we need our roads and we want them to be resilient, safe, and provide transportation outlets. Later on in the week, tomorrow, we're talking trash. It is Talk Trash Tuesday. We're going to have Seattle Public Utilities, King County, Recology, and Impact Bioenergy joining us. Water Wednesday coming up after that. Again, King County Wastewater Treatment Division, Site Story, and a few others talking everything water infrastructure. Thursday, we turn to building green spaces and transforming energy, and just how much those two are become interrelated as, again, we create solutions to fight back against anthropogenic climate change. And Friday is everything about building equitable infrastructure. We held our youth infrastructure panel on infrastructure last Saturday. We were pre-recorded, so we'll be playing that and doing a follow-up Q&A, as well as having a presentation from Duwamish River Cleanup Coalition. So very exciting week. I look forward to everybody joining. And like I said, if you had problems logging in, anything like that, we are a grassroots effort here. Please let me know, send me a message, be honest, any issues whatsoever. Thanks again for our presenters. I appreciate your time and look forward to working together and seeing what you guys do.
Thanks for what you do, everybody. Take care.
Thanks a lot. Have a good night.